I want to talk to you about hymns, the hymnography of the church. The hymnography of the church is at one and the same time one of the most important ways that we worship. But it's also, as a historian, it's one of the ways that we learn the most about the history of Christianity. It's through the hymnography, not through the writings of the church fathers or the councils or the canons, that we actually come to know what Christians think, what Christians did, and so forth, right? In the modern world, where we have access to digital libraries and translations, we have the writings of the church fathers at our fingertips. I can go to any library in the world and I can get access to the writings of St. John Chrysostom in a dozen languages, St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Cyril of Alexandria, instantly. In the Byzantine world, in the Russian world, nobody had access to this. First of all, they couldn't read. Second of all, they couldn't have even understood the elevated language with which the church fathers wrote, right? Nobody had access to the writing of John Chrysostom, to St. Gregory the Theologian, maybe a few super educated monks, but ordinary believers? No. So if we want to know what ordinary believers thought, prayed, worshiped, believed, what they knew about the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus, our single best access to that information is an examination of the hymnography of the church. Through the cycles of the hymnographic patterns, we know what Christians prayed day after day, week after week, right? We know precisely what they thought about Christ's birth, about his passion, about his teaching, about the other biblical characters. And one of the other things that we learn, which might surprise some of us, is that these hymns changed a great deal over time. They always reflected the hopes, the aspirations, the fears of the people of God at precise moments. We think we're so disconnected from the actual creation of hymnography in the modern world after the printing press that we lose sight of the fact that hymnography changed dramatically over the course of history, right? I'm going to give you just one kind of example of that, right? But I think it's one that really illustrates the point I want to make. We know through archival research and so forth that the earliest Christian hymns that survived down to the present day were composed in Jerusalem. Makes sense? It's the birthplace of Christianity. We have over 1,000 hymns that survive from probably the 4th and 5th century. Okay? Those hymns were originally composed in Greek, but they no longer survive in Greek. In fact, of these 1,000 hymns, only about 2% of them are in any Greek manuscript anywhere. They only survive in the language of ancient Georgian. And they are the hymns of the Vesper, Matin, and Liturgy of Sundays in a cycle of 8 weeks. We still have this cycle of 8 weeks in the modern church, but our earliest evidence comes from these 1,000 hymns. And so we know what the Christians of the earliest surviving evidence, the Christians of Jerusalem, were praying every night before a Sunday liturgy, every morning before the liturgy, every day during the liturgy. We have these 1,000 hymns, and they focus, not surprisingly, on the resurrection of Christ. Christians used Sunday as the commemoration of Pascha before they used one day in the spring to commemorate Pascha. So these 1,000 hymns are a reflection of what Christians thought about the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, to use just a little example, right? If you look at what these hymns say about violence, you'd be surprised. They speak about violence all the time. Okay? But in every single case, it is the violence that Christ suffered in the Passion, in the Crucifixion, for the benefit of us. So we have 1,000 hymns, a majority of which actually speak to the violence that Christ suffers, right? And this tells us what the Christians are thinking about, right? They're relating to Christ. They're through their prayer, hymns are prayer, their poetic prayer. Through their prayer, they are meditating on the suffering of Christ, but they're bringing their own suffering to it. Whatever challenges they have in their life, they are being reconciled, they are being comforted, they are given hope in the resurrection, right? They see themselves in the suffering. The hymns that speak in the voice of the Virgin Mary as she watches her son suffer, right? They give a voice to the community's own suffering. Let's jump 200 years. Okay? New hymns are created. Completely new genres of hymns have been created. Those old hymns are completely replaced. The hymns of the Sunday services, the Vesper service, the Matin service, the liturgy service, they've all been replaced because the cultural dynamics of the communities in Jerusalem have evolved. They've been transformed. The Christians are now part of the Roman Empire, right? They are no longer a persecuted minority. Their reality has shifted. They begin to employ imperial metaphors. They begin to think of themselves as Romans, right? Rome has influenced what it means to be a Christian. Christianity has influenced what it means to be a Roman, and the dynamics of the hymnography changes. And you get influences from Judaism to create an entirely new genre known as a kondakion, which uses a kind of almost fan fiction-like quality. You're studying St. Romanos the Melodist, the greatest example of this, right? Will tell the story of Jesus' birth. Now, we know from the Gospels, we have an account in Matthew that looks like this. We have an account in Luke that looks like this. It's an exercise I do with my students. Try to make this sound like this, and they don't really look anything alike, but, we look the other way at that, right? But so what St. Romanos the Melodist does is he takes those stories of Matthew and Luke, and then he invents his own drama through hymnography. The Magi come, and there's a conversation between the Virgin Mary and the Magi. The Virgin Mary speaks to Jesus, right? It's all presented as the biblical account, but it's not the biblical account at all. And in other words, the hymnographer is being unbelievably creative to think in new ways about what the meaning of the birth of Jesus is. And this is just one kind of new development in hymnography. And then there's another. And then there's another. At the beginning of the reign, Heraclius. So Heraclius was a Roman emperor. He became emperor in the year 610. It's Heraclius who is the emperor who is carrying an actual piece of the cross with him in the battle. He is militarizing the church. He's a heretic too. That's a story for another day. Maybe it's not so disconnected, right? He loses the relic of the cross in the battle to the Persians. It's stolen from Jerusalem. It goes to Persia for almost 20 years, okay? Heraclius is also the emperor who loses Jerusalem once and for all to the Arabs. So this is the context. The Feast of the Holy Cross, the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, was originally a feast in Jerusalem. If we look at the most ancient hymns for that service, it's a commemoration of the building of the church at Golgotha. It was a Constantinian church. The Emperor Constantine had commissioned it. So the commemoration of the Feast of the Elevation was originally a commemoration of the opening of the church at Golgotha. Okay? But the Emperor Heraclius, a very militant man, a man who is using Christianity to achieve his political ends, a man who's responsible for losing the relic of the cross, doubles down on his commitment to the cross in a very militaristic way. So he brings what had been a local festival of the cross in Jerusalem to Constantinople in the year 628. It's the ending of the Persian War. The Romans and the Persians have been at war for 30 years. And he commissions new hymns to transform the Feast of the Elevation of the Cross into something that affirms his authority. All right, so you have an emperor dictating to hymnographers what the hymns should be. All right, to this day, in the modern Orthodox Church, the troparion, that's the Greek word, meaning the central hymn for the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, derives from a hymn that this heretical emperor commissioned for the bringing of the Feast of the Cross to Constantinople. And what does this hymn do? It does two things that had never happened in hymnography before. The first thing that the hymn does is that the hymn uses the term vasilevs. Okay? Sorry to use Greek. Sometimes in English we think of vasilevs as the term for emperor. It does not mean emperor, it means king. Okay? Incidentally, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used the word vasilevs for King David. The Roman Emperor Heraclius is the first Roman emperor to adopt the term vasilevs for himself. Previous Roman emperors, they had many, many titles, but it had never been vasilevs because to be a king for the Romans was a no-no. They hated kings. They liked emperors. Okay? So Heraclius adopts the term vasilevs. So what does this central hymn for the Feast of the Cross, created in Constantinople in this year 628 do? It introduces the term vasilevs. Okay? In English, the hymn says, "Save, O Lord, your people and bless your inheritance, granting victories to the vasilevs," to the king, right? Granting victory to the vasilevs against the barbarians, okay? And protecting your empire through the commemoration of your cross. So what has happened in this hymn? Not only does the hymn recognize, right, that the emperor is God's instrument on earth, it empowers the emperor to use violence. It asks God to grant the emperor victory, military victory, against the barbarians. Who are the barbarians? In Roman political thought, a barbarian is anyone who's not a Roman. So the original inspiration for the hymn is the Persians, but of course it can be applied to anybody. It can be applied to the Slavs, it can be applied to the Arabs, it can be applied to the Latins, it can be applied to the other Byzantines or the other Romans with whom the emperor is warring, right? The hymn is literally the first step in a gradual sacralization of violence that occurs in the Byzantine Empire. Okay? Does that mean that we don't see the beauty of the cross? Of course not. The beauty of the cross, right? But what the hymn does, the hymn misdirects, right? In a sense, the hymn misdirects what 1,000 hymns had been doing before. The 1,000 hymns of the cross before had been focused on the death and suffering of Jesus. Violence is something that the righteous suffer. It is not something that the righteous impose. Right? There had been no hymn of Christian composition prior to that hymn, at least that survives in our records, that asked God to inflict violence on someone else. Not a single hymn that survives that predates that hymn does that. But Soson Kyrie does it. Right? This hymn that unfortunately remains the central hymn of the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross in the modern church, that is what the original Greek of the hymn states. It's still the way that the hymn is sung in all the churches of Hellenic descent, except the Church of Greece. They've actually changed it so that it's grant victory to the people. It no longer says the king, because you can't have a king in a modern democratic state in Greece. That's an aside, right? And in other traditions, like in the United States, the OCA, the Antiochians, they've changed the language of the hymn, right, in their translation of the hymn, but this is what the ancient Greek actually says. So let me come back to where I started. The hymns are this unbelievable deposit of our faith. They tell us what the average people, what the believers of Christ believe. But they also tell us precisely, they give us this window into the insight of what is happening on the ground. Right? We know that hymnography changed as conditions changed. But what we learn with a hymn like Soson Kyrie, and when we dig into the life of Heraclius, is that there are times in the history of our church when forces from the outside, just as they used an individual patriarch, or just as they used individual members of the church to advance their own agenda, so too the rich and powerful were able to use hymnography to enshrine their own power. And I think the point I want to leave you with is that just as in the ancient church, hymnography continuously evolved and changed and moved to reflect current conditions, we shouldn't now in the modern world, simply because we have a printing press, and presume that everything is fixed and it's always been the same way. We need to actually go back. We need to be traditional and go back to the ancient sources and understand their diversity and that they evolved to reflect the needs of the day. We don't need to be trapped into using a hymn that was commissioned by a heretical emperor to enshrine his power. Right? We need to realize that hymnography, like so many aspects of our church, are organic. They grow, develop, and they need to speak to present concerns and hopes in the resurrection. Thank you.